He saved every dollar he could for months just to give his little boy one night in a fancy restaurant. What happened instead would change both their lives forever. Nathaniel held his 6-year-old son Amari's hand as they entered Les Jardins on King Street. He had been saving for months, tucking away dollars from his construction work into a small envelope in the kitchen drawer. Tonight was Amari's birthday, and the boy had never eaten in a real restaurant before. Nathaniel had bought him a clean button-down shirt and ironed it 3 times the night before. The hostess led them to a table near the kitchen door. Nathaniel didn't complain. He helped Amari into his seat and sat across from him, quietly proud as his son's eyes widened at the soft lighting and white tablecloths. They were halfway through their meal when the manager approached. She was polite but firm. Some guests had expressed discomfort with their presence, she said. It would be better if they left. She offered to cover their appetizer. Nathaniel looked at Amari, who had gone completely silent, staring at his plate. He didn't argue. He placed the money from the envelope on the table, stood, took his son's hand, and walked out with his back straight and his head high. That night, after Amari was asleep, Nathaniel sat alone in the dark kitchen. The empty envelope lay on the table. He didn't raise his voice or shed a tear. He simply sat there, feeling something shift inside him. For years, he had made himself smaller in certain rooms so other people would feel comfortable. That night, he decided he was done shrinking. If stories like this move you, stories of quiet strength and dignity that the world often overlooks, I would be truly grateful if you subscribed. It took me weeks to research and craft this story, and your support helps me keep creating them for you. Nathaniel's days began before the sun rose. He would wake in the small 2-bedroom apartment, the floorboards cool under his feet, and move quietly so he wouldn't wake Amari. He packed the boy's lunch, usually a peanut butter sandwich, an apple, and a note that said, "You are brave," in careful handwriting, then woke him with a gentle hand on his shoulder and a whispered, "Time to rise, little man." By 6:30, he was on the construction site, the air already thick with dust and the smell of wet concrete. His hands, calloused and strong, moved rebar and poured foundations alongside men half his age. At 34, Nathaniel's back carried the memory of every beam he had ever lifted. Some days, the ache settled deep between his shoulder blades and stayed there until he finally lay down at night. He never complained. The work paid the rent and put food on the table, and that was enough. After work, he picked Amari up from the after-school program. The boy would run to him with a drawing or a story about what happened at recess, and for a few minutes the weight on Nathaniel's shoulders felt lighter. At home, he helped with homework at the kitchen table while dinner simmered on the stove, usually rice and beans or chicken thighs seasoned the way his grandmother had taught him. Amari would sound out words slowly, his small finger tracing the page, and Nathaniel would wait patiently, never rushing, even when exhaustion pulled at his eyelids. There were nights when the envelope in the drawer called to him. He would open it after Amari was asleep, count the bills and coins under the dim light of the stove hood, and add whatever he could spare that week. Sometimes it was $5, sometimes it was just loose change. He never touched it for himself. The money was for one thing only, a night where his son could feel like he belonged somewhere beautiful. Nathaniel had learned early that the world had rules about who got to sit where. He had felt it in job interviews when eyes lingered too long on his work boots. He had felt it in stores when clerks followed him down aisles. He had felt it most sharply on the rare occasions he tried to give Amari something extra, a birthday party at a park where other parents kept their distance, or a school event where he stood alone while other fathers talked easily in clusters. He never made himself small out of fear. He did it because he believed it protected his son. If he stayed quiet, if he took up less space, maybe the world would leave them both alone. But the truth was heavier than that. Some nights, after Amari was in bed, Nathaniel would sit on the edge of his own mattress and feel the loneliness press in. There was no one to share the small victories with, No one to hear that Amari had finally read a whole page without stumbling, or that he had finished a shift without his back locking up. He carried it all himself, because that was what fathers did, especially fathers who had no one else to lean on. The night before Amari's birthday, Nathaniel stood in the tiny bathroom ironing the new shirt. He ran the iron over the collar again and again, making sure there wasn't a single crease. Then he practiced with Amari at the kitchen table, how to hold the fork, how to say please and thank you in a voice that was clear but not too loud. Amari giggled and called it fancy school. Nathaniel smiled, but inside he felt something fragile and hopeful. For one night, he wanted his son to know that nice places weren't only for other people. The restaurant smelled of butter and rosemary and warm bread when they sat down. Amari kept touching the linen napkin as if it might disappear. When the waiter brought the basket of rolls, the boy's eyes went wide. He took one carefully, the way they had practiced, and whispered, "It's so soft, Daddy." Nathaniel watched him eat and felt a quiet pride settle in his chest. This was worth every skipped lunch, every extra hour on the site. They were halfway through their meal when the manager appeared at the table. She leaned in slightly, her voice low and professional. "Sir, I'm afraid some of our guests have expressed discomfort with your presence this evening. It would be best if you and your son finished elsewhere. Of course, your appetizer is on us." The words landed in the small space between Nathaniel and his son like a stone dropped in still water. Amari's fork stopped moving. He looked at his father, then down at his plate, and went completely still. The light in his eyes that had been there moments earlier simply vanished. Nathaniel felt something crack inside his chest, but he kept his face calm. He looked at the manager for a long moment, then at the other tables where people were pretending not to watch. He reached into his pocket, counted out the exact amount they owed, and placed it on the table. Then he stood, took Amari's hand, and walked out. They didn't speak on the way home. Amari held his father's hand tighter than usual, his small fingers pressing into Nathaniel's palm. When they reached the apartment, Nathaniel helped him into pajamas and tucked him into bed. Amari didn't ask any questions. He just rolled onto his side and closed his eyes. Later, Nathaniel sat at the kitchen table in the dark. The empty envelope lay open in front of him. He could still smell the restaurant on his clothes, the faint trace of rosemary and the sharper scent of whatever cleaning solution they used on the floors. He sat there for a long time, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional car passing outside. He thought about all the rooms he had entered quietly, all the times he had kept his shoulders down and his voice low so no one would feel threatened by his presence. He had done it for Amari. He had done it because he believed that was how you kept your child safe in a world that sometimes looked at black fathers with suspicion before it looked at them with humanity. But tonight, watching his son's joy disappear in a single moment, he realized something that hurt more than any construction injury ever had. He couldn't protect Amari by making himself smaller. He could only protect him by building something that no one could take away. Nathaniel didn't sleep much that night. He sat at the table until the sky outside the kitchen window began to lighten. Then he stood, washed his face, and went to work as usual. But something inside him had changed shape. It wasn't anger. It was something quieter and more dangerous to the life he had been living. Clarity. Over the next few days, he moved through his routine with the same steady hands, but his mind was elsewhere. He kept seeing Amari's face at that table, the way the light had gone out of it. He kept hearing the manager's polite voice explaining that they made other people uncomfortable. And he kept returning to the same thought. He didn't want his son to grow up believing that certain rooms would always be closed to him. One evening after Amari was asleep, Nathaniel opened his old laptop at the kitchen table. He searched for culinary training programs that offered night classes. He found one at the community college across town, a 10-month certificate in professional kitchen management and culinary arts. The cost made his stomach tighten, but he read every page twice. He wasn't just looking for cooking lessons. He was looking for a way in. The next morning, he called the program coordinator during his lunch break on the construction site. His hands were still dusty when he held the phone. The woman on the other end asked if he had any restaurant experience. He told her the truth. None, but he had been feeding himself and his son for 6 years, and he was willing to learn everything else. She told him the next cohort started in 2 weeks. There was 1 spot left. That evening, Nathaniel sat on the edge of Amari's bed after the boy had fallen asleep. He watched the steady rise and fall of his son's chest and made a decision that would have terrified him a week earlier. He was going to enroll. He was going to learn how restaurants actually worked, not just the cooking, but the money, the people, the systems that made places succeed or fail. And he was going to do it while still working full-time, because that was the only way the numbers would add up. He didn't tell Amari yet. He didn't tell anyone. But for the first time since the night at Les Jardins, Nathaniel felt something that resembled hope. It was small and fragile, but it was there. And it was enough to make him get up the next morning and start moving toward it. The first night of class, Nathaniel arrived with Amari's small backpack slung over one shoulder and his own notebook in his hand. He had worked a full shift, gone home, showered, changed, and picked up his son from the sitter. Amari was already sleepy, clutching his dinosaur toy. Nathaniel found a quiet corner in the classroom building where the boy could curl up on a couch with a blanket and his coloring books. "I'll be right here, buddy," he whispered. "You sleep if you need to." The classroom smelled of stainless steel and lemon cleaner. The other students were mostly younger, some fresh out of high school, others in their 20s chasing dreams of becoming chefs. Nathaniel, at 34, with construction dust still under his fingernails, felt every year of his life as he took a seat at the back. The instructor, Chef Elena Morales, was a small woman with sharp eyes and a voice that carried without effort. She started the class with a simple question: why do most restaurants fail? Hands went up. Bad food, bad location, no money. She listened, then shook her head. They fail because the people running them don't understand that every plate tells a story about whether you respect the person who's going to eat it. Nathaniel wrote that down. The first few weeks were brutal. His hands, so steady with a hammer or a trowel, felt clumsy holding a chef's knife. He cut himself twice in the first practical. Once he burned a pan of onions so badly the whole room smelled like smoke. Chef Morales corrected him in front of everyone. "Again," she said, "and this time watch the heat instead of guessing." Nathaniel's face burned, but he started over. He stayed late that night to clean the station, even though Amari was already asleep on the couch. He brought Amari every Tuesday and Thursday. The boy would do his homework at a small table Nathaniel set up, then fall asleep with his head on his backpack. Sometimes, when class ran late, Nathaniel would carry him to the car still sleeping. On weekends, he practiced at home. He burned rice. He oversalted soup. Amari would taste it and say, with complete honesty, "It's okay, Daddy, but maybe less salt next time." They would laugh, and Nathaniel would try again. Slowly, something shifted. His hands remembered flavors from his grandmother's kitchen, the way she balanced sweet and heat, the patience she had with a simmering pot. Chef Morales began to notice. After one class where Nathaniel had perfectly seared a piece of fish and built a simple pan sauce that made the whole room quiet while they tasted, she pulled him aside. "You have instinct," she said. "Most people can be taught technique. Instinct is rarer. Don't waste it." He didn't. He stayed after class to ask questions about food costs, about how to read a profit and loss statement, about why restaurants that seemed busy still closed their doors. He learned that location mattered, but so did consistency. He learned that staff turnover was often a symptom of poor leadership, not just low pay. He learned that the restaurants that lasted were the ones where people felt seen, both the ones cooking and the ones eating.
5 months in, Nathaniel had a small notebook filled with numbers and ideas. He had also saved more money than he thought possible by picking up weekend shifts and cutting every expense that wasn't rent, food, or Amari's needs. One evening after class, a supplier who had been delivering to Les Jardins mentioned in passing that the restaurant was struggling. The owner was looking to sell. Key staff had left. Regular customers had drifted away. Nathaniel went home that night and couldn't sleep. He kept seeing the glowing windows of Les Jardins, the table near the kitchen door, the look on Amari's face when the manager had spoken. He opened his notebook and started writing numbers. By morning, he had a plan. He approached the owner the following week with a quiet offer and a folder of projections he had put together from everything he had learned. The man was tired. He listened. 2 weeks later, with a small business loan from a credit union that believed in his numbers and his story, Nathaniel signed the papers. He was no longer just a man who had been asked to leave a restaurant. He was the man who now owned it.
Nathaniel waited until the paperwork was complete and the keys were in his hand before he told anyone. He picked Amari up from school on a Thursday afternoon and drove to King Street. The restaurant was closed for the day. The previous owner had already stepped back. Nathaniel parked across the street and sat for a moment, looking at the familiar facade. "Remember this place?" he asked quietly. Amari looked out the window. "That's where we went for my birthday." Nathaniel nodded. "It is, and now it's ours." He didn't take Amari inside that first day. He wanted to walk through it alone first. He unlocked the front door and stepped into the quiet dining room. The chairs were up on the tables. The air smelled faintly of old grease and lemon cleaner. He walked slowly through the kitchen, touching the stainless steel counters, opening the walk-in, checking the equipment he now owned. Then he went to the small table near the kitchen door, the one where they had sat 6 months earlier. He stood there for a long time. The next morning he came back with Amari. The boy held his hand as they walked through the front doors together. Nathaniel had asked the remaining staff to meet him there. When the manager from that night walked in and saw him standing behind the bar, her steps faltered. Recognition moved across her face like a slow wave. Nathaniel didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "I'm Nathaniel," he said. "I'm the new owner. I'd like to talk about how we make this place work for everyone who walks through those doors." She stood very still. For a moment, it looked like she might say something, an explanation, an apology, a defense. But Nathaniel didn't need any of those things. He had come here for something else entirely. Over the next week, he worked alongside the remaining staff, learning the rhythms of the kitchen he now owned. He kept the name Les Jardins, but changed the small things that mattered. He had the table near the kitchen door moved to the center of the room and set it with the best linens. He told every new hire the same thing. "If a father and his son walk in here wearing their Sunday best, you seat them where everyone can see how proud they are to be here." 3 weeks after he took ownership, Nathaniel brought Amari back for dinner. They sat at that center table. Amari wore the same button-down shirt, a little tighter across the shoulders now. Nathaniel ordered the steak and let his son choose whatever he wanted from the menu. When the food came, Amari looked around the room and smiled. "This is better than last time," he said. Nathaniel reached across the table and squeezed his son's hand. "It is, and it's going to stay that way." Word spread quietly through the neighborhood. The new owner of Les Jardins was a single father who had once worked construction. He hired locally. He trained people who had never worked in restaurants before. He started a simple tradition. Every Tuesday night, any child who came in with a parent ate for half price, no questions asked. He didn't advertise it as charity. He called it family tables. Amari began bringing drawings to the restaurant on weekends. Nathaniel hung them in the small office behind the kitchen, crayon dinosaurs and stick figure families eating at big tables. Sometimes, when the dining room was slow, Nathaniel would let Amari help roll silverware or greet guests at the door. The boy stood a little taller each time. Nathaniel never spoke publicly about the night he and Amari had been asked to leave. He didn't need to. The restaurant itself became the answer. Every time a family was seated without hesitation, every time a father watched his child's face light up at the sight of white tablecloths and soft lighting, the old wound healed a little more. One evening, months after he had taken over, Nathaniel stood in the kitchen after closing and looked at the line of tickets. The numbers were still tight, the work was still hard, but when he walked out into the dining room and saw Amari sitting at the center table doing his homework under the warm lights, something settled in his chest that had been restless for years. He had not bought the restaurant for revenge. He had bought it because he refused to let his son grow up believing that certain rooms would always be closed to him. And in doing so, he had opened something larger than a business. He had opened a space where quiet strength was enough, where dignity didn't have to be negotiated, and where a father and his son could sit anywhere they chose. Nathaniel's story isn't about one night in a restaurant or one man's rise. It's about what happens when someone decides they are done making themselves smaller for other people's comfort. It's about the long, unglamorous work of building something with your hands and your heart when the world has already decided what you're allowed to have. There are fathers like Nathaniel in every city, men who carry more than their share, who show up tired but still help with homework, who save quietly for dreams they're not sure they'll ever reach. Their strength is rarely loud. It shows up in iron shirts and patient explanations and the decision to keep going when quitting would be easier. If this story moved you, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. What part of Nathaniel's journey stayed with you the most? Have you ever had a moment where you decided you were done shrinking in some part of your own life? And if you could give young Amari one piece of advice about belonging and worth, what would you tell him? If these kinds of stories of quiet courage, of single parents who refuse to let the world write their children's futures, of everyday people who turn pain into something lasting, are the kind you want to see more of, please subscribe. Hit the bell if you want to be notified when the next one drops. Your presence here, your comments, your shares, they help these stories reach the people who need them most. Thank you for watching until the end, and thank you for believing that every father and every child deserves a seat at the table.